Welcome to the extra credits of Sean Baker and Mikey Madison's Anora. I'm Trey.
And I'm Kelsi.
So, Baker's Anora. This is a bold, ambitious film that I think reaffirms Baker's status as one of the most interesting independent filmmakers in the world.
Yeah.
Certainly one of our favorites. And it also introduces us to Mikey Madison as a legitimate star.
Yes.
And we have 3 of her here today.
Yeah, I mean, she's amazing.
To cement that, for those of you watching on YouTube. And Anora, one of my favorite movies of the year.
Yeah.
This isn't my favorite Baker film. I don't think this is like a 5-star masterpiece. There are some narrative issues, some tonal issues for me. But honestly, to a certain extent, who cares? 2024 has been a little bit of an up and down year in the cinema. And this is certainly one of the most exciting films and tragic films of the year.
Yeah, I think I'm right there with you. This is not my favorite movie of the year. It's not a 5-star masterpiece because of some of the kind of like character holes that we'll talk more about today. But it certainly is one of the best movies of the year. And I think that I have a pretty strong argument for why, knowing Sean Baker's filmography.
Yeah.
Like, I think he does some really successful things in this movie that he are his strengths from his previous movies. And then he tries to do something that are also strengths of his other movies, but you can't fit them all into one.
Yeah.
And that's where I come out on Anora.
Yeah.
But, you know, Anora is still really up there for me in his filmography. I feel similar to you. It's not my favorite of his movies.
Yeah.
Florida Project is still number 1 for me.
Easily. Yeah.
But Anora is my number 2 of his.
Yeah. So I guess we can talk about why in just a second, but I do want to say, like, we are big Sean Baker fans.
Yeah.
We had huge expectations going into this film, which was very unfair to the movie. We saw the trailer, incredible trailer, a lot of buzz coming out after Cannes, because obviously, like, all the awards that this movie won, and it did deserve those awards, and it's doing really well at the box office right now. People are talking about it as the front runner to win Best Picture.
Yeah.
If all those things happen and Mikey Madison becomes a star who is working with future auteur, indie to now mainstream filmmakers. Like, she was in a photo with Luca Guadagnino this morning.
What?
If that happens, fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm here for it.
Oh my God. I could totally see her in any of his movies. I'm thinking like Suspiria, but really like anything could work.
Yes, that would be amazing. So I'm down for the success of this movie. It deserves it. It's very, very good. It's just that there are some movies you watch where you're watching a film that has a ceiling of like 4 stars, to use Letterboxd ratings for a second. You know, like we just watched Conclave recently. We did an episode on that. We also did one on Gladiator 2.
Yeah.
Those are both movies that have ceilings to me of 3.5 to 4 stars with floors of like 3 stars.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And like that is
it's a good middle. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a good place to be. It's like good adult dramas that are exciting entertainment spectacles that can never really feel like they're going to be bad, but they never really feel like they're going to be great.
Yeah.
Versus Anora, which is like very clear in the trailer, you're like, this is going to be at the very least good.
Yeah.
And it could be, like how people are talking about it, a masterpiece.
Yeah.
And I want to get into why
it does
that might
have that
not
like
be
5-star
for us.
ceiling. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about Sean Baker for a second, because some of the listeners or watchers out there might not know Baker's filmography totally. He has carved out a unique niche in contemporary cinema. He tells deeply empathetic, humanist stories about usually people in survivor positions, like where they have to survive an exploitative economy. And they can also come from marginalized backgrounds. They could be put in positions of labor that have a lot of stereotypes or stigmas attached to them. And so he's done this in multiple different frameworks, right? He's done grounded social realist films like Takeout. He's done this in more elevated stories that are still tragic, like Tangerine.
Yeah.
He's done this perfectly in something like The Florida Project, or even one of my favorites, Starlet, which might be my second favorite movie of his.
Okay.
Which is very similar to Anora in terms of the character trajectory or arc.
Yeah, that's true.
I think Anora blends some Tangerine elements and some Starlet elements pretty well, actually, if you're a Baker fan. So he's done this a lot. I think his most riskiest project that didn't totally work for me, though is still very ambitious and interesting nonetheless, is Red Rocket, which came out a few years ago.
Yeah.
With the Simon Rex performance, which is excellent. So he has been inspired by some of the great indie social realist directors, like people like Scorsese and Spike Lee, and more indie than that, like Cassavetes, or somebody like Ken Loach or Ozu. Like, so he has really big inspirations. He keeps his own sensibilities. He has his own vision. I think he's a little bit funnier than all those directors that I just named, maybe except Spike Lee. I think they have a similar sense of humor. And with Anora, interestingly, I think he was able to keep those sensibilities while going a little bit more mainstream.
Yeah.
Because each one of his movies throughout his career has like increased scale quite a bit. And he's now joining a group of independent filmmakers that have now gone more mainstream that isn't like this rarefied tier, like a Luca Guadagnino, for example.
Yeah, Luca is a great example with Challengers. Like, I think, when Challengers came out, and that was such a fun episode to record, and that was a huge, success in my mind, partly because of the performances. It was just a really fun movie, but
the score, the cinematography, a lot of it is really extra, and it knows that tone very well.
Yeah, the Mike Feist, the Zendaya, the like Josh O'Connor of it all too. But I feel like it didn't capture some of the kind of weightier, more gruesome moments of A Bigger Splash that I love.
Sure.
In this in these relationships between the characters.
Yeah.
And so we talked a lot about that on our Challengers episode. But you're right. Like, I feel like Sean Baker is also kind of in that lane of an indie filmmaker who's now becoming more mainstream. And maybe that's kind of the reaction we're having too. Like, it reminds me of like Yorgos too, like kind of his trajectory. Like, these are, perfect parallels, but it does remind me of like people knowing Baker or knowing Yorgos specifically here, like from the Lobster, and then The Favorite, but then wider audiences maybe knowing Yorgos's work like attached to his films, or his name attached to his films, like from Poor Things, and gaining a wider audience. Of course, that comes with like the awards and the Emma Stone as a creative partner. But I think like the same thing is happening with Anora with us here, in that maybe Florida Project was something that I love more. Maybe like people have seen more so because it was on Netflix, right?
Interesting. Yeah, it was recently streaming on Netflix. Yeah.
But people still, I think, maybe connect it to like a Willem Dafoe character.
I think that's right.
And movie, where like The Lobster, maybe people connected that more to like Colin Farrell, performance.
Rachel Weisz.
And then like now with Anora, I do think, just with the kind of like buzz of it all, Sean Baker might be more widely known as a filmmaker attached to his work, and more people might be seated for his future films, which is really exciting. And so even though Anora didn't totally land, or didn't, I think, showcase all of Sean Baker's strengths tonally, that he does well in his like previous movies, I still am really excited that this movie is getting him so much attention. Yeah,
well, we talked about this with Yorgos on Poor Things last year. We talked about this with Luca on Challengers this year, which is that I'm really excited by the bigness of Poor Things and Challengers and Anora. The commercial appeal of these movies is very exciting, how they can speak to so many different audiences. And I don't think Anora is going to do as well as something like Poor Things or Challengers financially, but it should be like pretty critically successful. If it's not Mikey Madison winning an Oscar, this might win Best Picture, which will do a lot for it in terms of more people streaming it at home. And so that'll be interesting. But I think you're touching on something that I've talked about with Wes Anderson too, when he did Grand Budapest, or like after Grand Budapest, maybe around the kind of post Rushmore, let's say, era of Wes Anderson's career. There is a little bit of like, I'm going to sacrifice some of my more raw themes for these more conventional commercial standards, while still maybe holding like a higher bar to those commercial standards. So I'm still making something commercially that's elevating expectations for a mainstream audience, but I am sacrificing a little bit of my own sensibilities and maybe more tragic interests that are usually something you can find in more indie art house films to hit more theaters,
And maybe, I'm interested, like, maybe because we go into these movies knowing the filmmaker's interests and their filmography and like things that they return to over and over again, you see where they're pulling punches. And so I think that's like more clear in Anora because I'm familiar with Sean Baker's previous work.
Yes. And so In saying that, I still think Anora is pretty tragic, right? Like this isn't like just a good time at the movies. Like it is going to be funny. It is going to be elevated sometimes. It's going to be sometimes even feels like it's going to lean into some more surreal or like Tarantino-esque or go maybe more PTA-esque. But it tries to blend both of those tones, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And I don't think it totally does that, but it comes very close. And so the last 5 minutes of this movie does something that is not as tragic as far as you think it's going to go in terms of like it being this like, I don't know, Goodfellas-esque ending or Uncut Gems-esque ending, but it does go somewhere that is depressing. And that is, true to Sean Baker's sensibilities. But again, I'm not sure the movie really deserves the ending it had, and we'll get to that. So let's talk about quickly Mikey Madison's performance as Anora, because I think this is going to be the biggest appeal for a lot of people going into this movie is like, who is this young up and coming actor? I saw them in Scream, maybe Scream 5, I believe. And I saw them possibly in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But can they lead a movie like this that is trying to do a lot, right? Like they're trying to make Mikey Madison do a young Sharon Stone from Casino as Ginger meets young Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman. Can she nail that tonal balance? And I would say that she actually does more than the movie does. Like the movie actually doesn't give her great characterization. I think it's actually a pretty thin character in my opinion. But what she does with her expressions, her eyes, the way she reads a room, reads people when they're talking to her, her reactionary vibe. I think she's really funny, really sad, and really fascinating. And a lot of that credit goes to Madison and not as much the writing. So I want to shout her out right at the top here before we even hit on spoilers, because I think she is, you should go see this movie just to see what she's up to in this film.
Definitely. Yeah. And Sean Baker saw her in Scream and immediately, right, like called
I think that night
his agent or someone to call their Mikey Madison's agent.
Because he usually casts first time actors in the leads of a lot of his movies. And he was like, maybe I'll just find somebody who's only done a few roles at this stage in their career. And that was really smart.
Yeah. I mean, no, she's great. I think, I do also want to note though, like, Sean Baker, I'm assuming even within the writing, like had some pieces in directing her of the more subtle moments of her kind of like questioning Vanya, or, there are definitely like pieces that I'm sure aren't like necessarily written dialogue, but are, things that Mikey Madison and Sean Baker work together with. But I would agree with you, like for holistically, I do think Mikey Madison is bringing kind of more sad elements, like behind her eyes, right?
Yes.
Of like, I kind of, am having fun right now, but also like, should I be protecting myself right now? Like she's able to bring that kind of, right, like self-awareness to her character.
She forces the audience to question how self-aware is this character.
Yes.
Yeah. And then also humanizes her at the same time. I mean, the writing does not do that as much for her.
Yeah.
But the writing doesn't also, it's not bad writing, right? Yeah. It's just underdeveloped writing to me. And again, we'll get into spoilers in a second, where you're not thinking the movie's judging her by any means, but it does ultimately paint her as like naive, which is sort of fair because she is like a young 20-something in a position where she doesn't actually have much power. But the movie almost takes away her agency when we don't know enough about her character, so therefore don't know how self-aware she is in the film at any given time. And so Mikey Madison delivers enough nuanced, subtle moments when people are talking to her, when we're getting a shot of her like taking her makeup off in the mirror, where you're thinking, okay, how aware is this character of what's happening with Vanya, what's happening with his parents, or these three stooges she has to go across New York with, or with Igor, that character, and what happens there, because that actor does a very good job. He's in his own movie. He's like in his own romantic movie. And I don't think Anora is in the same film as him, but it is still like a really interesting character. So, this is the Baker project. He tries to add dark comedy and elevated fantasy to social realism. He tries to reveal the American dream as sort of a con, right? A nightmarish con. And I do think he successfully does that here. I think so. And I think there's a lot of like socioeconomic nuance in this movie. I think there's a lot of destigmatizing sex work and dancing and like what Anora's character does and like all of her coworkers at the club. I think the movie does a good job with those things. It just never totally leans into what direction it wants to do best. And then ultimately leaves me flat at the ending, but not the intended flat that you're supposed to feel emotionally at the end. I almost feel like intellectually flat at the end of the film.
I think that's what it is. I think a lot of his other movies, he does a better job like playing with the tones at the right moment. And it does feel like we're watching like 3 different movies here. And it doesn't totally shake out to have a catharsis or something that feels like it's like honoring like Anora's character versus like you think of like a Haley in Florida Project. You feel like you know, there's a really like life in Haley as a character. And I think that's like what you're speaking to in terms of the flatness of Anora's character, which we'll get into in a second, because I think it's almost like built into the suspense of the plot and how it's written that actually then undercuts Anora's character. Yeah,
like the big reveal that maybe she never had control of the situation in the first place.
Yeah.
And how she reacts to that. You're kind of like, wait, I thought you were this character, now you're this character.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're going to get into that. All right. Before we jump in, I want to quickly direct our listeners or watchers at home on YouTube to the description of this episode. If you're listening to this on your podcast platform, just go to the show notes. If you're listening to this on YouTube, hit the description of this episode where you'll find a link to our Patreon. And if you sign up as a free member right now, you'll have access to our Sean Baker's The Florida Project Deep Dive, which is a 2.5, 3-hour deep dive of me talking about why that's one of my favorite movies of the decade. And then also Kelsi surprisingly falling in love with it as much as me, which was really nice on that episode. And talking about the tragedy that is Mooney's Cinderella fairy tale story that ends up being a tragedy at the very end.
Yeah. And I mean, we talk about his other movies as well. And like, I don't think we like spoiled things or we would let people know, but we talked about how he is so good at showing like the tragedy as a result of kind of what you were talking about, the circumstances, and making the environment a character in his movies.
Yes.
To make it not like this melodrama that we normally see in stories where a character is like living in poverty.
Yeah.
And is able to tell a story that doesn't feel like from a damage-centered lens.
Yeah.
And so we really go into that on the Florida Project because we kind of like live watch the movie too.
Yes.
But
he's so good at humanizing people who are usually left to be stereotypes in mainstream cinema, or even indie cinema to a certain extent. So yeah, that episode for right now is free on Patreon. And also if you're a Gladiator fan, the Gladiator deep dive on Patreon is free for free members right now too, because of Gladiator 2 coming out, which is
Strength
a
and
very
honor.
good movie. Okay. So Anora Spoilers. Go see this movie in theaters if you can, or stream it on streamers in the next few weeks. I'm sure it'll be out there. So Anora tells the story of Annie, right?
I think so. I'm just going to call her Anora.
Anora, a 23-year-old Russian-American dancer living in Brooklyn. And as in many of Baker's films, as you put it just a second ago, the environment quickly becomes a character. The environment of her work life, the environment of her, taking the subway back after a long night working back to her home, having like seeing a roommate. There's sort of a life that in the periphery, like there's Anora's life is in the periphery of this movie.
Yeah.
Which is a good way to put it, like why I was kind of frustrated at the end of the film, which is what, like, it's called Anora. And I do think there's like a subtextual reason for that, which is like her job does not afford her, or like her economic circumstances do not afford her to have characterization in this narrative, like a life, like an identity
time outside of work. Yeah,
right.
Like
She's sleeping during the day,
going to work. Yeah,
but I don't think we see enough of this first act to really demand that kind of reflection, or maybe forgiving the narrative for not letting us know who she is more, considering what the movie puts her through. So we're gonna get into that, but we get to see a little bit of her transactional reality, like her relationships in the day-to-day life. And so backing up a little bit, the opening sequence of this movie is pretty spectacular. We see that the film's credits are placed right next to Anora's face as she's giving a lap dance. And we get this Bakerism, is what I'm going to call it, which is like the score drop of this movie, which is this contradictory club music about you're going to have the best night of your life or something like that. And I don't think I've ever heard this song, but it did a really good job of effectively getting across like what Scorsese does in a lot of his movies, or Spike Lee does in a lot of his movies, which is using a song that will speak to the narrative's tension. And it reminded me a little bit of like Mean Streets, in terms of playing with
that
music
iconic
in that
opening,
in that way, in terms of like you're about to watch like a tragic fall of a character.
Yeah. I mean, he does play with that in, Florida Project with Celebration.
That's right.
And then bringing it back at the end with an instrumental version of Celebration with a more kind of like darker undertone of that song that we have such a big cultural relationship to. And same with like Bye 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 and Red Rocket.
Oh, I love that one.
Yeah.
That's really good.
I think we walked out of the theater and I was like, I forgot the opening. I didn't like recognize the song, I guess. And that's something that I do expect from a Baker film. You're right.
Yeah. So basically, Anora's life takes a dramatic turn when she meets Vanya.
Mm-hmm.
And this character is a reckless, entitled man-child, I guess is the best way to put it, of a Russian oligarch family. And he's played with a hilarious, carefree energy by Mark Edelstein as the actor. First-time feature, I believe, which is incredible. And he basically plays like a Russian Richie Rich, for those of you who've seen that McCulkin film. And I loved the character in as far as him being just like so absurdly free and privileged and ignorant and like naive, and like the way they portray him is like not quite dangerous, so you don't really feel like Anora's life is in danger until like halfway into the movie.
But he's so like careless with her life.
But he's so careless with her that you're thinking that, okay, anything can happen to her.
Yeah.
Especially because like when they go to Vegas together, for example, you're thinking, is this the first time he's been to Vegas with someone in Anora's position? Has he done this before, is what you're thinking at certain points. And so the movie does a really good job, and so does the performance, of like never letting you settle into something that it'll just play as a tragic comedy. You're kind of wondering, is this going to turn into a tragic drama? Which the movie does sort of do in the last 5 minutes of the film. But basically, Vanya offers Anora $15,000 to spend a week with him, or I think they go back and forth on that number, which is a funny shout out to Pretty Woman.
Right.
And about halfway into this film, that transaction escalates into this like fantastical, comedic, tragic whirlwind of tones where you have these two lead characters eloping in a Vegas chapel. And then we go into this unpredictable territory where his family sends these like three stooges, but really like are gangsters who Baker tries to humanize and like put them in positions where like they don't even want to be there in the first place.
Yeah, they're like doing a job. They have to leave their family functions. Yeah,
their job is to try to keep Vanya at home while you're having Anora telling them to get out of, her house now that she's married to Vanya. And they kind of have to keep them there, right? That's their goal. And we're starting to notice halfway into the film, like, oh, is Anora, like, is this character self-aware of the power dynamic with Vanya? How much is she kind of pre-planned, like, what she's going to do with this, like, new marriage and potentially, like, her access to the wealth that he has? Because really what she finds most appealing about Vanya, I think, is his freedom.
Right.
Or his carelessness, but I think that would be maybe too unfair to the character. It's more like honestly, just like truly his freedom to do with what he pleases. And that is like really appealing to her. And so like when he proposes to her in bed in Vegas, there's a moment where you're going like, and the character does this too, like, I don't know if I believe you. And you're thinking like, Anora, like how self-aware is she even being in this moment? Like, is she trying to get something out of this character? And it's still not super clear. And it's not clear right up until really the big reveal about halfway into this movie that Vanya's using her to stay in the country.
Right.
And not just
to avoid going to like work for his father's family, like very Succession type of family.
Yes. And so like while Anora has been like objectified throughout the film by Vanya, or like sexualized by him, and you're kind of wondering how much does he actually care about her, you really realize that he is truly looking at her as like a transactional way into the country and to get away from his family. So what about
this? Or
this?
to just like have fun too, because he ultimately knows that it's not going to be something that his family will approve of or that will be long lasting.
Right. So the movie is really tonally jumpy, like 2 acts in. We're blending romantic screwball energy with the escapist fantasy energy, with the serious dramatic thriller energy.
Yeah.
Until we really get to the point where Vanya escapes and then it turns into like 4 people going around Brooklyn or New York City looking for this drunk
very
Russian
Tangerine.
oligarch son.
Yeah.
Very Tangerine energy.
Yeah.
So what are you feeling at this point in the film? Because I was confused. I was conflicted and confused.
Yeah.
I was enjoying my experience, but I was thinking, I don't know if I totally love where this movie is leading me.
Sure. Yeah. I think so. At this point, I think you're right. Like we have those different movies going in. I had a lot of fun in the sequence where they do get married, and I know like this isn't going to last somehow, or I'm suspicious, but I'm having a fun time in this like alternate reality of like the wealth that Vanya has and like the fun that these two characters are having together.
Right.
And you're right. Like I am wondering then also like for Anora, you know, how aware is she of the kind of transaction that's happening here? Of course, like Sean Baker needs to keep us on the audience on the kind of unknowing end of how sincere are Vanya's intentions in saying like, let's get married. How much is Anora aware of him basically like wanting to marry her for whatever reason? There are some pieces of her character that you feel like maybe she's naive and just, you know, is going to like go for this. Maybe she's in love, right? Which it definitely positions us as in that way as we go farther into this. Or maybe she's suspicious. And like, I think those questions, which are a driving tension of the first part of the movie, then become so flattened in this comedy piece of the movie.
Which is still fun.
Which is still a lot of fun. It's actually my favorite sequence of the movie when her and the three guys are like going around looking for Vanya.
Yeah.
But it becomes flattened in that her character then becomes this I guess like character who's saying like, I love Vanya. Vanya loves me. I'm his wife. You all don't know what you're talking about. And we just need to find him because once I find him, like everything will be fine and we'll be able to work it out because we love each other.
Right. Yeah.
Of course, the kind of like that wears off and you see her coming to a realization. Maybe, you know, the characters were right in saying like, especially Toros, who is the main guy, who's working for like the family, right?
Yeah, he's in a lot of
Sean
Baker's movies.
Guy.
Yeah,
his
name is Karen Karagulian. I apologize if I did not pronounce that correctly, but he's excellent.
He's so great, and he's in Tangerine. He's also the motel manager in Florida Project.
The owner, yeah.
Because Willem Dafoe's the manager. But he's so good. And when he tells Anora, like, you don't know this guy, he is like this spoiled brat. And he takes everything for granted, like you don't know what you're talking about. That kind of tension, that Anora kind of it's unraveling as they're looking for him. And finally, when we have that moment, you know, going into meeting the parents, you're thinking, is Vanya, because he's like offline right now, he's hungover, he can't talk. Is him not saying anything because he's hungover? Is it because he actually doesn't love her? That moment, to kind of end how it ends, with such kind of a letdown, which is what Sean Baker is going for in a realistic way.
Yeah,
but
he's trying to be true to people's actual lives.
Actually honoring Anora's character.
Yes.
That's the problem with it. So I think, like, to answer your question, at that moment of the film, when we're going into this really fun, like, looking for Vanya, you know, all these things happen during like that time of getting the car towed in New York City, like this funny like bit about parking it just in New York. The throw up scene, which is awful. It's so, oh my God.
Yeah.
And then, you know, or them like just sitting at the diner, like kind of like deflated, right? Them walking across the boardwalk. Like, but they also
use these moments to build up Igor's movie within this movie, which is Igor's like going through this, hey, I'm just like a hired gun, but not even a gun. I'm just like a hired dude to like try to keep Anora at this house or in the van or whatever. And then you realize like, oh, he lives with his grandmother. He's actually seems kind of sweet, even though he has all these tools like to smash up a candy shop or whatever. And there are moments in the second act that are supposed to be like Three Stooges comedy that there is this kind of like, Igor has his own romantic movie going on. Anora is not aware of this movie. He's in his own film, right? And that makes it a little bit like a part of the problems that you're talking about, which is that basically Anora is just like a thinly written character.
Yeah.
And I think that you can use the justification of her sleeping during the day and her at her work at night or in the AM as a reason for like not knowing more about her character. But this is like a 2-hour, 20-minute movie where we are doing a lot of bits, you know, and they're funny bits. Like when the lead henchman is at the synagogue or church and he's like having to text while he's like in the middle of this ceremony. It's really it's really funny.
The funniest moment in the movie when he has to leave the baptism. He's like, sorry, everyone. Like, gotta go.
It's hilarious. I just wish so much of this movie didn't feel like a bunch of bits where Anora was kind of like along the ride.
Yeah.
And I wish I knew more about the movie's titular character that it literally named itself. Like it named itself Anora.
Yeah.
And it just feels like I want to know the character more, and Mikey Madison is doing a lot to express how she feels the character might be feeling, but the movie actually never gives us like the Sharon Stone Ginger from Casino character study that I thought this movie was going to be.
Yeah.
And maybe it is a problem with my expectations. So if you think it did do everything right, you know, listeners or people watching at home, I totally understand why. It's still a very good movie, in my opinion. But like, I was expecting this to be a subversion of Julia Roberts as Pretty Woman, delving deeper into what Scorsese gave us with a Sharon Stone figure who was interestingly and similarly exploited by that Robert De Niro character in Casino. And we see her kind of like tragic journey in that film, and she's painted as this subversive antagonist in that movie, but really she's probably the most sympathetic figure in Casino until the last like 25 minutes with the kid stuff and all that. But that is the direction I thought they were going to go into, and they never fully go there.
No, yeah. Well, I had a reaction when you were like, maybe I had too high expectations, but I actually think that it is a flaw in the writing for me. Like,
and it's not a case of like, I want this movie to be another movie. The movie is saying this is what it's going to be, and then it takes you somewhere else, and then takes you somewhere else.
I agree. Yeah, I think for me, like while I understand like you why people might really like this movie because it feels kind of like it could be an enjoyable 3 different movies in a movie, right? Like we have all these different tonal shifts that feel like a journey. But I think you're right in that the movie is supposed to be about Anora. We don't learn about her like we would in his movies like Starlet.
It's a great example,
Or like even in Tangerine, where we have this like fast paced, literally like looking for someone all night is the plot of the movie, and you learn so much about the characters and like the emotional relationships, right? And so I think here, like the reason actually that Sean Baker had to cut us off from the characterization of Mikey Madison's character of Anora is because you have to have the audience not knowing exactly what's going to happen at the end of this.
Yes, it needed that tension.
Is she going to get justice? Is she going to stay in this marriage? We have to not understand totally what she's thinking, or maybe like how self-aware she is, because otherwise then that like takes away the kind of big drop or surprise.
And that's a complicated conceit for a character.
And I just don't personally think that is that interesting because of how he decides to take it in a direction at the end, which is more Sean Baker. So I agree. I think that basically like we are wondering and are questioning like how self-aware is Anora during these like 2 first thirds of the movie. And then we realize that, okay, well, can we jump to like the family here?
Sure. Yeah.
So then once the family comes into the picture and Vanya, right, is kind of like waking up a little bit from his hangover.
At the courthouse.
Right. Well, on the plane,
jet,
he basically it becomes clear to Anora that Vanya just did this carelessly, got married carelessly, and also admits to his parents, right, that like this was not that serious, is kind of like degrading towards her. And she has the realization that, oh, he didn't love me. Like I loved him, and I was just completely like not even considered as a person. And so in order to have that drop that Sean Baker wanted, which was supposed to be the kind of the emotional shift in the movie, you have to be unaware of what Anora totally thinks besides this idea of maybe her like slowly being suspicious of Vanya.
Yeah.
But that I think is like not totally, it's not even like not honoring her character. It's like not being like fair to her character or giving her agency. I love the Sharon Stone like Ginger comparison, because Ginger like in that transaction with Robert De Niro is so upfront.
Yeah.
And same with Julia Roberts and Richard Gere, like is very upfront about like, I know like basically like what's happening here. And you feel like that character is a character, right? Anora, you feel like she might be like a naive, right? Like person.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's really like, I don't think that's what Sean Baker's totally going for. And not that I'm judging her of like, well, it's not like that as an audience. And I don't even think
the movie's not doing that.
Yeah, but it doesn't work out to have that drop or that reveal, because then I'm like, oh well, I think that Anora would be kind of more aware.
based on who we knew in the first act, where she's kind of
like she knows how to take care of herself.
She's arguing for herself as she's eating dinner with her coworkers, like, and the boss is telling her to go back out there, and she's like, no.
Yeah.
Like that kind of energy from her is continued throughout the film in terms of her speaking up for herself.
Exactly.
But there is a little bit of like ownership and agency and self-awareness in the first act with her character that the movie can't have her have in order to have these Vegas sequences, in order to have these like going around New York City looking for Vanya, in order to have this annulment happen, or the final conversation where she does get the cathartic yelling at the parents because they raised a loser, but it's not enough.
It's not
based
enough,
on what we know about the character in the first act. Like, I don't believe that Anora would have taken all night to have this big blow up.
Yeah, and what we learned about her in the first part.
Yeah. So it was like, to me, it's less that they used it. I mean, it's a part of it, like that the movie necessitates a thinly written character for the tension to be felt by the audience. Like, I think that is a part of it. But I think the reason what this movie struggles for me to be like just a 4-star film, which is totally fine.
Yeah.
Again, to use letterbox language, I apologize. Is that it sacrifices the interiority of Anora, or puts a lot of the weight on the shoulders of Mikey Madison to do that, to express the interiority through subtle moments. But it sacrifices a lot of the characterization that we want, considering what the first act gives us,
and what we're used to.
Honestly, what we're used to, but also what we deserve. I think, based on the first act of the movie, to then play in this multi-toned narrative, which it wants to be like this,
and not only what we deserve, what Anora deserves.
That's right. And it wants to play in like this multi-toned narrative where it's like grounded realism, it's got elevated absurdity. It wants to both be a PTA movie and a Quentin Tarantino film, which is an incredibly ambitious thing to try to shoot for. I don't think it's ever been successfully done. And maybe he's the one who's come closest to it in recent years as a Gen X filmmaker himself, who explicitly has said that he is inspired by Paul Thomas Anderson and Quentin Tarantino, of people that are his peers, of his generation. And so we never get the kind of radical ending of Inglourious Bastards that the movie almost provokes the audience to want. We almost want a shootout sequence of this Anora against the Russian oligarchs that would be totally condescending to the very real tragic character
we don't
study.
Actually think a John Wick ending is going to happen, but
no, but
I think it is like
you mentioned Kill Bill when we were watching it.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to be like, if you're going to introduce us to a character who like really is kind of like self-advocating and really holds her own, it doesn't feel like kind of within the heightened reality that you've given us in this like search party sequence and this heightened comedy. It doesn't feel like it is satisfying, or her character has gotten like justice at the end of the movie. And I know that's where Sean Baker's going. Yeah, I get that. But you're playing in that kind of like Tarantino heightened reality that it's like, why not just do it? Like, why not play with that? For me, I know that's like expecting that is actually expecting a different movie. But I think like,
but it also be pandering to like the very real people that Anora is representing, in terms of like people who are like in the outskirts of culture, who like pop culture and cinema and mainstream movies especially have like created stereotypes about and have perpetuated those things.
Yeah. So it's not that I'm like totally arguing for that. I'm just arguing for like, or maybe expecting, based off of the movie I've been shown at this point, some sort of like satisfaction beyond saying your kid's a loser.
Yes, agreed.
There needs to be a little something more,
little better writing,
because of what you said of the cost of Anora's like kind of agency like throughout this movie. And so then also like I love that you brought up like PTA, that it's like kind of floating, the vibe of this movie's floating in the middle of like a Tarantino PTA, obviously not quite as heightened as like a Tarantino, but with PTA, where PTA is so good at like, you know, driving the car like very fast into kind of a heightened situation that still feels like realistic or like
grounded
grimy
enough,
or like, you know, the tragic for a character, or like really like heightened like found family for a character, right? He's so good at creating a world like completely, and part of that is so much that he is great at creating like these really complex characters. And so if
who are
going
given
to
backgrounds and like there is depth to their characters, and we know about their personality and who they're friends with a little bit more. Like, think Boogie Nights or Think Licorice Pizza.
Yeah. Like, and so I think that Sean Baker is like kind of like floating between these two kind of like heightened realities, and then doesn't do that piece, which Anora is lacking, is that kind of like understanding or depth to her character.
Yeah.
Then that ending feels unsatisfying to me, at least. Even though I really, enjoyed the movie, it's just that like that ending where she just says like your son's a loser doesn't feel enough. It doesn't feel like it honors her character enough.
Right.
And I get where like Sean Baker's trying to go in that, especially when the mom is talking to her and, Anora is like, you think it's going to be that moment. Like Anora says, I'm going to get a lawyer. I'm going to like take you for everything you have.
I grabbed your arm. I was like, let's go. Like, and again, Sean Baker being the humanist director he is, again, doesn't want to condescend. In fact, I would say he probably thinks movies like Pretty Woman are problematic, even if this movie's deeply inspired by it, because of what the
unrealistic turn it takes at the end.
Yes, it lets audiences be entertained by something that in our reality is actually much more tragic. And I do think he wanted to actually give us something that is more true to somebody who would be in Anora's position, which is actually this is going to be an American dream for someone who is the wealthy person, and then it's going to be an American nightmare for someone else who actually doesn't have access to those kinds of resources.
Yeah, I think, it obviously is not the wrong move to like do that in terms of like Sean Baker and what he wants to do with his movies, in having the mom say as a response, oh, you think that you're going to get a lawyer, number one.
Yeah.
Like, how are you going to afford that? And number two, like, not only do we have economic resources, like, we have enough power to ruin your future, like, to make sure that you basically, like,
and friends and family,
survive.
too. Yeah.
And
it felt like she was talking to the audience, too. Like, oh, you thought you were going to get this? Like, you're not going to get it?
Yeah.
But the movie, again, doesn't feel like it deserves that.
But again, that's fine if Anora were then characterized with more depth as we go into this.
That's all it is, I think. Yeah. And maybe a little bit less the screwball energy in the second act. Even though it's a really fun act, and I wish there was a TV show of those three guys like driving around New York City looking for rich sons of oligarchs, like oligarch families. Like that's pretty awesome. But yeah, it doesn't totally lean into either side well enough, right?
Yeah, that's I guess how I feel too.
And so, and I think the characterization is a huge part of it, but also the tonal imbalance is a huge part of it. So while I appreciate that there isn't some kind of false triumph, if you will, at the end of the movie, and we do have this like brutal reality check of the closing car sequence between Igor and Anora, and that through line really coming clear about the American dream being this ultimate con, which is certainly something that Baker's been doing throughout his entire filmography. I'm still like, just like you, really conflicted about the movie as a whole, and if it even deserves the tragic final 5 minutes, which I think are distressing, beautiful, poignant, and really like great acting and a great composition in terms of how the car is shot too. Like a great 5 minutes, a truly cinematic 5 minutes. The end of this movie. That again, I don't think the movie deserves based on the film that I was watching.
It didn't feel like the movie, like, and Anora's characterization built up to that moment enough for it again to like be something that her character I just think the movie doesn't like deserve that kind of like realness at the end that, for example, his other movies might like. And I think that has to do with his other movies being strong character movies. Like, we're observing different elements of the character's life, and that piece is like taken out or like cut out because of the comedic heightened middle that you're talking about.
And this is what we were saying at the top, which is like, you do have to sacrifice some of your sensibilities or your own, and what Baker's so good at, which is character studies about people who are in the margins of society, or have been, portrayed in that way. And he did have to sacrifice some of his like political interest and social interest, and sacrifice the Anora character to make something that he felt like was more commercial. So I bet he thinks, and people who give this movie like 5 stars and love it and think it's a masterpiece, I bet people who are in love with this film and the makers of it feel like the final 5 minutes actually does subvert the audience expectations, does provoke the audience, and maybe even indict us about what we want. I just wish it gave us a little bit less of what we keep talking about, which are still fun beats, because this is such a wonderful director and he's assembled such a wonderful team of like being in Vegas or of driving around New York City.
Yeah, then we need a little bit more of like
that first act of Anora.
Yeah, and less of Anora feeling to the audience, like as she's written, like a naive character. That's the only piece that I felt like was off, and really wasn't something that I've seen really in Sean Baker's previous films.
Yeah, like taking almost accidentally taking agency away from a character to achieve some kind of like commercial tension
or like surprise at the end.
Yes, surprise at the end. So okay, let's get to our extra credits.
Okay.
So I think Mikey Madison obviously deserves the credit.
She's amazing. Yeah.
I think I
hope she's in a Guadagnino movie.
I mean, I can't wait. Like in 2 or 3 years, whatever he's got cooking, we'll be there for it opening night. Yeah, I mean, she already said recently, like somebody asked her the question already, like how many phone calls have you gotten to star in what movies? And she said none.
Wow.
But she also said she tells her agents and publicists, which like I believe, to only get back to her about certain screenplays or directors that are interested in working with her if they actually match her interest. And if her interests are like Sean Baker, then I'm assuming she's got some pretty incredible taste and she's not willing to just like be the next superhero in a Marvel movie, you know? So I'm really excited for her career. It's gonna be a very fun one. I do think she already has kind of entered so fast into that Florence Pugh Zendaya, you know, maybe she'll be in Dune 3. I don't know, that Dune verse of actors. I guess Denise already assembled all of the great late 20s, early 30s actors. My extra credit is going to go to the Three Stooges, because I feel like we haven't done a good enough job talking about the comedy of this film because we were conflicted and frustrated about what the movie was doing tonally or with the lead character. But Yura Borazov as Igor is very good. I've mentioned a few times that he is the kind of subplot, the major subplot of this movie, which is that he is slowly falling in love with this person he's been hired to watch throughout the film. And as he watches Anora, I think he sees that they're similar, right? They are in worlds where their realities are purely transactional, their relationships are transactional, and the power dynamics are never in their favor or seem to never be. And we learn that he's like in his grandmother's house and he drives his grandmother's car. He sticks up for Anora a few moments that don't feel like pandering. They feel more like
I thought that felt like deserved
her.
When he was like, I think it's appropriate, like if Vanya apologizes. And then the mom is, you know, like, my kid will not apologize to anyone.
Right.
Yeah.
So he's very good in this movie.
Yeah.
I've never seen him in a film, so I'm excited to see what he's got next too. And I think he's done some television. My only issue with this character is that he obviously is in like a single romance movie. Like, I don't know how to put that. Like, he's in his own romantic...
He's in a different movie than like Anora?
Yeah, like...
Is with him?
Like, there is a subplot in this movie where two characters are falling in love, but really it's just Igor falling in love with Anora. It's not Anora falling in love with Igor. And so it's a weird part of the final 5 minutes where she does realize that this person respects her because he took the ring, so she could sell that because it's obviously worth a lot of money. And her first reaction obviously is to like be romantic with him or have sex with him, and the kind of like jarring, tragic, final like distressing crying and almost like grieving that she's going through about this, like the way she's been exploited or objectified over the past few weeks with Vanya and his family is really sad. But again, it feels almost like the comedy of the character and the romance of the character that he's interested in, or at least the romantic feelings he has for Anora, doesn't feel totally deserved either because he's just in his own film. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Which I think is fun and interesting as far as like a subplot in a movie like this. That's actually very good writing.
Yeah.
But I actually don't want to read too much into their relationship because I don't think there really is one.
Yeah, I agree too. I felt like it was kind of flat for me also. In beyond the idea though that I do think what you're talking about worked, and that he actually like, I appreciated his like kind of love for Anora, even though I don't know if it's like love, but like
just respect, admiration.
Yeah, of her like really, you know, like advocating for herself, like standing up for herself, like and like speaking on when she's wronged. So I think like that was like a successful piece of it, but ultimately didn't work for me either.
Yeah, and there's also some more pandering stuff like that night after they get back from the jet. They have some very complicated conversations, but again, it does seem like they're painting her to be weirdly naive, and the power dynamic is confusing, and she throws down the blanket. A part of this movie is about Anora realizing that she doesn't have much control, but again, that doesn't really... You can still have agency and still be taken advantage of or exploited, and so that's a confusing line this movie never nails.
Yeah.
And so that through that character, I think it's actually really clear because it's supposed to be the most heartfelt part of the movie. If you're going to call anything in this movie heartfelt, it'll be the relationship that he has to the character. But yeah, I think that's a little odd. But it is very funny watching Igor and Toros, who is played by Karan Kagrulian, and Garnik, who is the other Armenian henchman, run around New York City with Anora looking for Vanya, or the kind of like the humor of them not wanting to keep Anora in the house, like the idea that they're just like hired rent, like I guess hired henchmen, like henchmen for rent or gangsters for rent. Like that's a funny idea. And Sean Banker's biggest strength is, I think, a little bit of his weakness here, which is he spends so much time with them because he's trying to humanize people who have, stereotypes against them, or he's trying to destigmatize many of the figures in this movie, or all the characters. And I do think he spends just too much time with these henchmen, but I still give extra credit to the comedic elements of this movie that only exist because of what these actors are doing. Yeah.
I love the three relationships, or the three characters' relationships with each other there. But you're right. I think I had a similar reaction of Sean Baker's strength in trying to humanize and show that these three men are like doing a job, especially in I think maybe the best scene of the movie, one of them comedic wise, when Toros has to leave like the baptism, and gets a call right from the family. Like you're very aware of Toros's role.
He's like texting.
Yeah. That kind of build up, like that's a very funny moment and something that Sean Baker's great at. And also the other moments where, like Anora breaks his brother's nose and he's like, I'm just like trying to do a job, like please stay still, like that kind of thing. Or Igor only expecting to be there for like 2 hours, right? And turns into like 48 or something, right? And so I think like those are Sean Baker's strengths and where the comedy comes from. And there's like a dark comedy, but also, like, there's during that particular sequence when they first go into the house and they're like, just stay still to Anora, you can't separate that moment and like that comedy, even if it is dark humor and it's like knowing, from also like the idea that in reality Anora would be in danger here, or the like violent images that we've seen toward women in like film before. Like you can't separate that. And so
it does feel convenient, like, oh, we're just in a fantastical movie. It's elevated. We're in a comedy now.
Like don't actually want to capture her. Isn't it funny that these men don't actually want to be violent towards her? They're just trying to and she's actually the one that's being violent towards them. Like flipping it. The Anora Mikey Madison performances were funny. The physical comedy of like them, getting beat up by her was like funny.
Falling into glass tables. Yeah.
But ultimately, like I was like, there's something like that's not self-aware here that feels strange, because you feel like Sean Baker would be self-aware.
Well, in the moment, I didn't really think. I mean, it's a really great observation. In the moment, I didn't think too much about it. I did think it was like interesting subversion of like what we were expecting, in terms of like these henchmen coming to like basically what looks to be kidnap her, and they definitely de-escalate that. In fact, it seems like the henchmen respect her more than the Russian oligarch family by the end of the movie. But again, it all feels sort of tonally imbalanced. And it also almost at the end of the movie, again, feels pandering to the Anora character. And as far as the henchmen kind of being like, well, we did tell you that Vanya was like not a good guy. And we told you this family was like not a family you could trust. And now look at this situation where we're going to send you some money to your account, like whatever they said, $10,000 or something like that. And then she goes and picks it up the next morning with Igor at the bank. And it does feel like it's like a cautionary tale and also like a young 20s moral lesson for a character that is like Sean Baker knows better than to do that with, because he already is trying to do so much to humanize the character. So taking agency away from them and taking away their kind of self-awareness feels unnecessarily complicated, or he maybe even like decomplicates what could have been a more morally complex story. Yeah, I guess my extra credit is actually a critique. My bad.
No, but I think the extra credit of these like three guys,
they were great bits.
Yeah. Especially during the moments where they're searching for Vanya is great. It's where Tangerine's comedy like really is heightened. It's just that it focuses, you're right, more so on the men's relationships with each other, especially the brothers, like which is very funny. It's great stuff. But you're right, like unfortunately, because the Anora isn't the center of like those relationships or like that comedy all the time, as it is as like Sean Baker does do in Tangerine, and we like get more depth from characters throughout the comedy. It just doesn't work as much here. But I think it is a good extra credit because that's my personal favorite part of the movie.
Which it shouldn't be.
I know, because it's
no, not shouldn't be for you, but I agree that it's the most like successful. Like
you're saying
he weirdly feels the most comfortable
the
there.
Movie almost because it should be like a shorter piece of the movie,
much shorter. Yeah.
Or again, like we've repeated too many times probably now, but like the idea of like shifting Anora's character or tweaking her somehow. In characterization.
Yeah, I really love the first act of this movie, and the third act come down doesn't feel deserved because the second act is so much fun. And the movie doesn't feel like it wants to be fun. So I do think it's ultimately a really ambitious swing from Sean Baker. I really want people to go and see this. So if you've listened to this whole episode, you have not seen this movie, thank you for listening, but go see this film. We've seen it twice. I'm totally fine if this one's Best Picture. I haven't seen everything in the year like Brutalist or Queer or Nosferatu, which will have no chance because it's a horror film. But there are a lot of movies to come that I expect will compete, for my own personal rankings of the year. But Anora is easily a top 10 movie of the year. Probably in my top 5 right now, sitting comfortably next to Challengers and Furiosa and Dune, among other movies. But I'm really excited to see what Baker's, got next. I'm sure he has something planned because this is a movie he's been thinking about for 15 or 20 years. And I'm really excited to see the future of the career of Mikey Madison.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, next time on the podcast, we are going to be covering probably some Patreon episodes. We have a big Denzel week coming up because Gladiator 2. If you liked what you hear, please go ahead, or like what you heard, please go ahead and like and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Or if you're listening on your podcast, 5 stars on Spotify or Apple, leave us a review. Let us know in the comments of our YouTube video, what did you like about Anora?
Yeah.
Or maybe like, what are your favorite Sean Baker movies? And if you agreed or disagreed with like, our conflicted feelings about the Anora character. I think this was a really fun movie.
Yeah, definitely. And I understand why people love it too. It's just that I feel like it's being talked about as if the strengths of like a Florida Project. Maybe that's where I'm coming out a little bit harsher on it. But let us know what you think. And also, I love a Sean Baker ranking if you've seen his other movies.
Yeah, let us know in the comments. All right, guys. See ya.
Bye.